My own son pushed us off the cliff to silence us. As the wind roared in my ears and the ground rushed up to meet me, the last thing I heard wasn't a scream of regret from him, but my wife whispering a command that would save our lives. Pretend to be dead. If we move, they will finish the job. I am Garrett Thorne, 72 years old, and until 48 hours ago, I thought I was the patriarch of a loving, successful American family. I was a structural engineer who spent 40 years building bridges that could withstand earthquakes and hurricanes, yet I failed to see the cracks in the foundation of my own home. If you have ever trusted someone with your life only to have them betray you for money, hit that like button. It helps to know I am not alone in this nightmare. And before I tell you how I survived a 40-meter fall and crawled back from hell to exact my revenge, tell me in the comments which city you are watching from. Your support is the only thing keeping me sane right now. It happened in a heartbeat. One moment I was standing on the edge of the scenic overlook in the North Cascades, admiring the sunset with my son Derek and his wife Mallory. The next moment, I felt two hands on my back. Not a stumble, not an accident. A shove. A deliberate, forceful shove. Gravity took over instantly. The sensation of weightlessness was terrifying, a sick lurch in my stomach that defied all logic. I reached out my fingers, clawing at empty air, trying to grab onto anything, a rock, a root, a tuft of grass, but there was nothing, just the vast, indifferent emptiness of the canyon. I heard Patricia scream a sound that ripped through my soul before the wind swallowed it whole. We were falling. The world spun in a dizzying blur of green pines and gray granite. The impact didn't happen all at once. We crashed through the canopy of an ancient fir tree first. Branches whipped against my face, tearing at my skin like angry claws. I felt a thick bough slam into my ribs, knocking the wind out of me, but it broke our momentum just enough. We tumbled, bouncing off the rough bark, spinning uncontrollably until we hit the slope. We didn't stop. We rolled. I felt rocks slicing through my jacket, sharp edges tearing at my jeans. The world was a violent kaleidoscope of pain and noise. The sound of my own body hitting the earth again and again was sickening, a dull, meaty thud that vibrated through my skull. And then finally, a sudden, brutal stop. I landed hard on my left side in a small depression, a hollow filled with decaying leaves and sharp scree about 20 meters from the canyon floor. Silence. For a moment there was absolutely no sound. My brain couldn't process the data. I was staring up at the darkening sky, seeing the tops of the trees swaying gently, as if nothing had happened. Then the pain arrived. It didn't creep in. It exploded. A white-hot spike of agony shot up my left leg, stealing my breath before I could even draw it. I tried to move to shift my weight, but a wave of nausea rolled over me so intense that I almost blacked out. I looked down. My left leg was twisted at an angle that legs are not supposed to twist. The tibia had snapped. I knew that sound. I had heard steel cables snap under tension, but the sound of my own bone breaking was a dry, hollow crack that echoed inside my head. The pain was blinding, pulsating, with every beat of my heart, turning my vision red at the edges. Patricia. Panic surged through the haze of pain. I turned my head, ignoring the screaming protest of my stiff neck. She was lying 3 feet away, tangled in the roots of a huckleberry bush. She wasn't moving. Her silver hair, usually so perfectly kept, was matted with pine needles and dirt. "Patty," I rasped. My voice was a broken croak. My throat felt full of dust and copper. I tasted blood. I had bitten my tongue during the fall. "Patty, please." She didn't stir. A cold dread, colder than the mountain air, settled in my chest. I dragged myself toward her. Every inch was a battle. I dug my fingers into the loose soil, pulling my broken body across the rocks. The jagged stones scraped my belly, but I didn't care. I reached out and touched her shoulder. It was warm. She gasped, It was a wet, ragged sound. Her eyes flew open wide and terrified. Blood was streaming down her forehead from a nasty gash near her hairline, blinding her left eye. She coughed and pink foam bubbled at the corner of her lips. Ribs, I thought. Her ribs have punctured a lung. As a former head nurse, she would know exactly what was happening to her, which terrified me even more. "We need help," I choked out, tears mixing with the grit on my face. My hand went to my pocket for my phone, but it was gone. It must have flown out during the tumble. "I have to call Derek. He must be terrified. He must be looking for us." I filled my lungs, preparing to scream my son's name to let him know we were alive, that we had miraculously survived the fall. I opened my mouth. "Derek, help us. We are down." Suddenly, a hand slammed over my mouth. It wasn't gentle. It was forceful, desperate, pressing my lips against my teeth until I tasted more blood. It was Patricia. Her eyes were locked onto mine. The terror in them had vanished, replaced by a steeliness I hadn't seen since she worked in the emergency room 30 years ago. She shook her head violently, her bloody fingers digging into my cheeks. "Don't," she hissed. The word was barely a breath, but it carried the weight of a command. I stared at her, confused, my brain sluggish from the shock. "What are you doing?" I tried to mumble against her palm. "That's our son up there." "Shut up, Garrett," she whispered, her voice trembling, not with fear, but with a horrifying realization. "Look up, just look up." I followed her gaze. Through the gaps in the fir branches, way up at the edge of the cliff, where the guardrail ended, I saw them. Two silhouettes against the twilight sky. They were small from this distance, just black shapes, but I knew them. The slump of the shoulders, the way the taller figure stood with his hands in his pockets. Derek. And beside him, Mallory. They weren't running around. They weren't waving their arms or shouting for help. They were standing perfectly still, looking down into the abyss, like spectators at a zoo, like people waiting for a show to end. "Listen," Patricia whispered, removing her hand slowly, but keeping a finger pressed to her own lips. The acoustics of the canyon were strange. The wind carried sound down the cliff face, amplifying it like a funnel. I heard the crunch of gravel. Then a voice. My son's voice. It wasn't panicked. It wasn't the voice of a grieving child. It was annoyed. "Do you see them?" Derek asked. No, Mallory's voice drifted down, sharp and impatient. "The trees are too thick. But nobody survives a drop like that, Derek. It's 40 meters straight down onto granite. They're dead." I felt my heart stop. It literally skipped a beat, suspended in a moment of pure, unadulterated horror. The physical pain in my leg vanished, eclipsed by a pain so much worse that it threatened to tear me apart from the inside out. My son. The boy I taught to fish. The boy whose college tuition I paid for by working double shifts. He wasn't checking to see if we were okay. He was checking to confirm the kill. "Are you sure?" Derek asked again. "I need to be sure, Mal. The insurance policy won't pay out if it looks like a disappearance. We need bodies." "They'll find the bodies eventually," Mallory scoffed. "Just call 911. Put on the act. Tears panic the whole show. Tell them they slipped while taking a selfie. It's a tragedy. Remember, I lay there frozen." My breath hitched in my throat. I looked at Patricia. Tears were streaming silently down her face, cutting clean tracks through the blood and dirt, but she didn't make a sound. She squeezed my hand so hard her knuckles turned white. "Do not move," she mouthed the words, her eyes boring into mine. "If they hear us, they won't call for help. They will throw rocks until we stop moving. Play dead, Garrett. For the love of God, play dead." A sob built up in my chest, a massive heaving thing that wanted to explode out of me. I wanted to roar. I wanted to scream at the sky and curse the day he was born. But I bit my lip. I bit it until I felt fresh blood flow. I forced my body to go limp. I closed my eyes, leaving just a tiny slit open to watch the monsters on the cliff. I lay amidst the rotting leaves, the smell of damp earth and pine filling my nose, listening to my son discuss the best way to report my death. I was a structural engineer, a man of logic and steel. I thought I knew how the world worked. But as darkness swallowed the canyon, I realized I knew nothing. The bridge between father and son hadn't just collapsed. He had blown it up while I was still standing on it. "Let's go," I heard Derek say, his voice fading as he turned away from the edge. "It's getting cold." I watched the shadows disappear. I lay there in the growing dark, my broken leg throbbing in rhythm with my broken heart, and I made a vow. I pushed the pain deep down, locking it away in a box where I used to keep my love for him. "You made a mistake, Derek," I thought, staring into the black canopy above. "You didn't come down to check." I squeezed Patricia's hand back. We were alive. We were broken, bleeding, and trapped in a canyon miles from civilization, with winter setting in. But we were alive. And as long as I had breath in my lungs, I wasn't just a victim. I was a witness. And I was going to be their reckoning. The silence that followed the crash was not truly silent. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that magnified every other sound in the canyon. I lay there with my face pressed against the damp earth, the metallic taste of blood filling my mouth, and I focused entirely on my ears. My eyes were useless in the growing dark, and the position of my head meant I could only see the roots of the fir tree, but my hearing seemed to sharpen, fueled by the adrenaline of terror. The wind whistled through the high branches like a mournful choir, but cutting through it came the sounds I dreaded most: the crunch of gravel, footsteps. They were pacing up there. I held my breath, ignoring the stabbing agony in my left leg. Beside me, Patricia was rigid, her hand still gripping mine with a strength that belied her injuries. We were like two statues toppled in the mud, waiting for the sculptor to decide if we were worth keeping or destroying. Then came the voice. It drifted down from the ledge, distorted slightly by the wind, but unmistakable. It was the voice I had listened to for 38 years. The voice that had once asked me to check for monsters under the bed. Now that voice was discussing whether the monsters had successfully finished the job. "I cannot see them," Derek said. His tone was not frantic. It was not the high-pitched wail of a grieving son witnessing a tragedy. It was tight, anxious, the way he sounded when he was late on a mortgage payment, or when he had scratched my car as a teenager. It was the sound of someone worried about getting caught, not someone worried about loss. "Are you sure, Mallory? That is a long way down. What if they are just hurt?" I squeezed my eyes shut, tears leaking out to mix with the dirt on my cheeks. "Please, Derek. Please call out. Please scream for help. Prove me wrong. Prove that you are still the boy I raised." But then the second voice cut through the air, sharp and cold as an icicle. "Mallory, my daughter-in-law, the woman we had welcomed into our home, the woman whose student loans I had quietly paid off 2 years ago so they could start fresh." "Stop pacing, Derek," she snapped. Her voice was terrifyingly calm, a stark contrast to the chaotic beating of my own heart. We did the math. It is 40 meters straight down onto granite and shale. Physics is on our side. Even if the fall did not kill them instantly, the shock will. And if by some miracle they are still breathing down there, look around you. It is getting dark. The temperature is dropping to freezing tonight. I heard the sound of a lighter flicking. She was lighting a cigarette. Up there on the edge of the cliff where she had just murdered her in-laws, she was taking a smoke break. "And do not forget the wolves," she added, exhaling. "I heard a pack howling last night near the cabin. If the fall did not finish them, nature will clean up the mess before sunrise. Nature will clean up the mess." That was what we were to her. A mess. Debris to be swept away so she could access the bank accounts. I heard Derek let out a shaky breath. "But what if someone saw us? The ranger station is only 10 miles back." "Nobody saw us," Mallory hissed. "We parked the car behind the tree line just like we planned. The trail is empty." Stop being so weak. Do you want to go back to that miserable little apartment with the eviction notices taped to the door? Do you want to explain to the loan sharks why you do not have their money next week? It is either this or prison Derek. It is either them or us. $4 million, Derek. Focus on the number, $4 million. The number hung in the cold air, drifting down to the canyon floor to slap me in the face. That was the price tag on my life. That was the value of Patricia's kindness. My entire existence, 40 years of hard work, of saving, of sacrificing vacations to put money into college funds and retirement plans, it all boiled down to a ledger entry for them. A memory flashed through my mind, unbidden and agonizingly bright. It was 1992. A suburban cul-de-sac. A bright red Schwinn bicycle. Derek was 6 years old, wearing a helmet that was slightly too big for his head. He was terrified of taking the training wheels off. He was crying, shaking, holding onto the handlebars with a death grip. "Daddy, don't let go," he had sobbed. "I am scared I will fall." I had knelt beside him, looking into those big, tear-filled brown eyes, and I had promised him. I said, "I will never let you fall, son. I am right here. I have got you." I ran behind that bike for hours, my back aching, holding him steady until he found his balance. And when he finally rode away on his own, looking back with that beaming smile, I felt a pride so fierce it almost knocked me over. Now, lying in the dirt with a shattered leg, I realized the bitter irony. I had spent my life making sure he never fell. And in return, the moment I turned my back, he pushed me. This was not an accident. This was not a spur-of-the-moment decision born of anger. This was an execution. They had scouted the location. They had checked the ranger schedules. They had calculated the height. The conversation I was hearing was the final item on a checklist. Derek spoke again, his voice lower this time, almost resigned. "Okay. Okay. You are right. So what do we do now?" "We get in the car," Mallory said, her voice sounding like she was organizing a grocery list. "We drive back to the cabin. We wait 2 hours to make it look like we were searching for them. Then we drive to the police station in town." "You need to cry, Derek. Can you do that? Can you cry for the cameras?" "I can do it," Derek said. I felt Patricia's body convulse slightly next to me. A silent sob. It hurt me more than my broken bones to know she was hearing this. She had always defended him, even when he stole money from her purse in high school. Even when he crashed our car and lied about it, she always said, "He is just finding his way, Garrett. Give him time." Her time was up. He had found his way, and it led straight to hell. I heard the crunch of gravel receding, the heavy thud of car doors slamming shut. Then the engine roared to life. It was a sound of finality. As the hum of the motor faded into the distance, leaving us alone with the wind and the encroaching night, a strange transformation took place inside me. The fear began to evaporate. The shock began to recede. In their place, something hot and dark began to coil in my gut. It started in my chest and spread to my fingertips, overriding the pain. They left us here to die. They left us for the wolves. They were driving back to my cabin to drink my wine, to sleep in my bed, rehearsing their lies for the police. They thought the story ended here. They thought the credits were rolling. I turned my head slowly, gritting my teeth against the spike of agony from my leg until I was looking directly at Patricia. Her eyes were open, staring at me. The tears had stopped. In the moonlight filtering through the trees, I saw the same fire in her eyes that was burning in mine. We were not just husband and wife anymore. We were partners in a war we hadn't known we were fighting. I reached out and wiped a smear of blood from her cheek. My hand was shaking, not from cold, but from rage. I looked up at the empty ledge where the stars were just beginning to appear, indifferent to our suffering. I did not pray for salvation. I did not pray for a rescue helicopter. I prayed for strength. If God does not take me tonight, I whispered into the darkness, my voice raspy but steady as stone. Then I swear on my life they will wish they had checked the bodies. Patricia nodded, a single sharp movement. She squeezed my hand, her grip like a vice. "Let us get out of here," she whispered. I dug my fingers into the freezing mud, dragging my broken body forward. The car was gone, but the hunt had just begun, and this time we were not the prey. The sun vanished behind the ridgeline and took the last of the warmth with it. Darkness did not fall gently in the Cascades. It slammed down like a heavy iron door, bringing with it a biting cold that seemed to hunt for any exposed skin. Within 20 minutes, the temperature plummeted toward freezing. I could see my breath puffing out in white clouds against the gloom. My teeth started to chatter, a rhythmic clacking sound I could not control, but the cold was actually a blessing in disguise because it began to numb the raw nerve endings in my shredded leg. I knew we were on a ticking clock. Hypothermia would kill us long before dehydration or starvation did. But we could not move, not with my legs swinging loose like a broken pendulum. I am an engineer. I have spent my life solving structural problems, fixing things that are broken, reinforcing things that are weak. I looked down at my left shin in the failing light. This was just another structural failure. The tibia was snapped, likely a spiral fracture, given the torque of the fall, and the muscles were spasming, pulling the bone fragments past each other. I needed to realign the load-bearing column. "Patricia," I said, my voice tight. "I need your belt." She did not ask why. She was already shivering violently, shock and blood loss taking their toll, but she fumbled with the buckle of her heavy canvas hiking belt. She handed it to me, her hands ice cold. "I need you to hold my shoulders," I told her. "I am going to set the bone. If I pass out, slap me. Do not let me sleep." She moved behind me, bracing her knees against my back, wrapping her arms around my chest. I could feel her heart hammering against my spine. I looked around the hollow and found a sturdy branch of driftwood, stripped smooth by the elements about the length of my calf. It would have to do. I took a deep breath of the freezing air. I visualized the anatomy of my leg. I visualized the bridge cables I had tensioned over the years. I grabbed my heel with one hand and the calf muscle with the other. On 3, I whispered, 1, 2. I pulled. The sound was wet and grinding like stones being crushed in a mortar. White light exploded behind my eyes. The pain was not a sensation. It was a physical entity, a demon that ripped through my nervous system with claws of fire. I opened my mouth to scream, but only a dry, strangled gasp came out, because Patricia clamped her hand over my mouth again, muffling the sound. My body arched off the ground, fighting against her grip, every muscle seized in a violent protest. I felt the bone ends grate against each other, searching for purchase, until finally, with a sickening pop, they slotted back into something resembling alignment. I collapsed back against Patricia, gasping for air, sweat freezing instantly on my forehead. The world spun in lazy gray circles. I almost vomited, but my stomach was empty. "Do not stop," Patricia whispered in my ear. Her voice was shaking, but it was fierce. "Tie it off, Garrett. Tie it off now." My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold the branch. I placed the wood against the outside of my leg. I took the canvas belt and cinched it tight just below the knee. Then I used the laces from my hiking boots for the ankle. It was crude. It was ugly. But it was stable. "Now me," Patricia said. She turned her face toward me in the moonlight. The gash on her forehead was deep, a dark ravine running from her hairline to her eyebrow. The blood had started to congeal in the cold, forming a dark, sticky mask over the left side of her face. But fresh, bright red blood was still oozing out with every beat of her heart. I took off my flannel overshirt. I used my pocket knife to rip a long strip from the hem. My fingers were clumsy, numb blocks of meat, but I managed to fold the fabric into a thick pad. I pressed it against her wound. She flinched, sucking in a sharp breath through her teeth. "Hold that," I said. I ripped another strip and wrapped it around her head, tying it tight enough to apply pressure but not cut off circulation. She looked like a war casualty, her silver hair matted and wild, a bandage made of plaid flannel across her brow. We sat there for a moment, huddled together for warmth, two broken old people in a pit of despair. "Garrett," she said softly. Her voice sounded clearer now, less slurred. "Did you notice the tea?" "The tea?" I asked, confused. My mind was still reeling from the pain in my leg. "Before we left the cabin, the Earl Grey Mallory made for us. Did you notice it tasted bitter?" I frowned, thinking back. I had barely touched mine. I had been too busy checking the map. "She put something in it," Patricia said. "I saw her crushing pills in the kitchen when she thought I was in the bathroom. I switched the mugs, Garrett. I poured ours into the plant pot by the window and filled them with plain water. That is why the fern died this morning." I stared at her. The implication hit me harder than the fall. "If we had drunk that tea," I whispered, "we would have been unconscious before we even reached the trail she finished. Or we would have been so groggy we would not have been able to grab the branches on the way down. We would have hit the bottom. She did not just want to push us, Garrett. She wanted to make sure we could not fight back. She drugged us. It was premeditated murder." A cold fury settled in my chest, burning hotter than the pain in my leg. Mallory. The woman who smiled at our Thanksgiving dinners. The woman who called me Dad. She had crushed pills into our tea like she was poisoning rats. "We have to move," I said. My voice was different now. It was not the voice of a victim. It was the voice of a man with a debt to collect. "We cannot go up," Patricia said, looking at the sheer rock face above us. "No," I agreed. "And even if we could, they might come back to check." "We go down." "Down?" she asked, looking at the dark abyss below us. I closed my eyes and pictured the geological survey map I had memorized 20 years ago when I bought this land. I knew every contour, every fault line. "There is an old mining trail," I said, "from the Silver Rush in the 40s. It runs along the creek bed at the bottom of the canyon. It is overgrown and washed out, but it leads to the old service road about 5 miles east. It is the only way out." "5 miles," Patricia whispered. "We can do it," I said. I rolled onto my stomach. I dug my elbows into the frozen mud. I could not stand. I could not walk. But I could crawl. I dragged myself forward. My splinted leg dragged behind me, a dead weight that caught on every root and rock. Every inch was a battle. I reached out, grabbed a huckleberry bush, and pulled. Patricia followed right behind me. We did not look like human beings anymore. We looked like creatures from the earth, covered in mud and blood slithering through the underbrush. The pain was constant, a white noise that drowned out the wind, but I focused on one thing. Just one thing. The look on Derek's face when he realizes the ghosts have come back to haunt him. Left hand. Right elbow. Pull. Drag. Breathe. We moved inch by agonizing inch, sliding down the scree slopes, tearing our clothes on thorn bushes. The night was pitch black, filled with the sounds of the forest, the snap of twigs, the rustle of unseen animals. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled again, closer this time. Let them come, I thought, gripping a sharp rock and pulling myself forward. Let the wolves come. They will find that the prey in this canyon has teeth. We are not dying tonight. We are just starting to live for the first time in years. The forest did not want to let us go. For 2 days and 2 nights, we dragged ourselves through a green hell that seemed to have no end. Time ceased to exist in a linear fashion, dissolving into a blurry loop of drag, pull, scream, and breathe. My leg had swollen to twice its normal size inside the makeshift splint, and the skin around the break was hot to the touch, pulsating with a rhythmic throb that echoed the beat of my own heart. I knew what that meant without Patricia having to say a word. Infection had set in. The fever dreams started on the second afternoon, transforming the shadows of the trees into looming monsters and the sound of the wind into the whispers of my dead ancestors calling me home. "Garrett, stay with me," Patricia would urge, her voice raspy and weak but relentless. "Just to that ridge. Just to that big oak tree." She was the only reason I was still moving. My wife, who had spent 40 years organizing charity dinners and tending to her rose garden, had transformed into a creature of pure iron. She cleaned my forehead with snow. She forced me to chew on pine needles for vitamin C. She checked the circulation in my blackening toes every hour. But even she was fading. The gash on her head had stopped bleeding, but her eyes were sunken, rimmed with dark bruises of exhaustion, and her hands shook uncontrollably whenever we stopped to rest. By the time the roofline of our cabin came into view, the sun was setting on the second day. It should have been a moment of relief seeing the structure of cedar and stone that I had designed with my own hands. Instead, it felt like a cruel joke. Smoke was curling lazily from the chimney. Warm golden light spilled from the windows onto the snow. It looked like a postcard of a perfect mountain retreat. But inside that warmth, inside the sanctuary I had built to protect my family, sat the man who had tried to murder us. "We are not going to the front door." I rasped my throat, feeling like it was filled with broken glass. "Around the back, the root cellar." Patricia looked at me, confusion clouding her feverish eyes. "The root cellar is locked from the inside, Garrett." "Not that one," I said. "The other one. The one I never told the kids about." Years ago, during the height of the Cold War panic in the 80s, I had succumbed to a bout of paranoia common among men of my generation. When I laid the foundation for this place, I excavated a secondary space, a storm shelter, reinforced with concrete and steel, accessible only through a hidden hatch in the retaining wall behind the house, and a secret panel in the library. I had called it my doomsday insurance. I never thought the doomsday I was preparing for would be my own son. We circled wide through the brush, avoiding the security lights that I knew would trigger if we stepped onto the manicured lawn. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. I was skulking through the dirt like a criminal, terrified of the very security system I had installed to keep criminals out. I had paid $40,000 for those cameras and motion sensors, and now they were the weapons of my enemy. The entrance to the shelter was buried under a thicket of overgrown blackberries. Thorns tore at our remaining clothes and sliced into our skin as we cleared the debris. My hands were so numb I could barely feel the cold metal of the latch hidden beneath a fake rock. It was rusted. It had not been opened in 15 years. "Help me," I grunted, fitting my fingers into the groove. Patricia placed her hands over mine. Together we pulled. I screamed silently as the effort sent bolts of lightning up my shattered leg. The metal groaned a screech of protest that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet night. We froze, terrified that Derek might have heard. But the wind was howling through the eaves, masking our intrusion. With one final heave, the hatch gave way, revealing a dark, gaping maw that smelled of stale air, damp earth, and old secrets. "Get in," I whispered. We slid into the darkness, closing the heavy steel door above us. The silence was instant and absolute. We were inside the belly of the house now. I fumbled for the emergency flashlight I had left on the hook 2 decades ago. Miraculously, the batteries still held a faint charge, casting a sickly yellow beam onto the concrete walls. Now came the hardest part. The ladder. It was only 10 feet up to the trapdoor that led to the space behind the library bookshelf, but with a broken leg, it might as well have been Mount Everest. I had to pull myself up using only my upper body, dragging the dead weight of my leg behind me, gritting my teeth so hard I thought they would crack. Every rung was a fresh torture. I was sweating profusely, the fever making me dizzy, swinging between burning hot and freezing cold. "You can do this, Garrett," Patricia whispered from below, pushing at my good foot to give me leverage. "You built this house. You own this house. Take it back." I reached the top. I found the release mechanism, a small lever hidden in the masonry. I held my breath and pulled. The hydraulics hissed softly, still functional after all these years. The false wall slid open just an inch enough to let in a slice of light and the muffled sound of jazz music. We were in the panic room, a narrow space sandwiched between the library and the master bedroom. It was dusty and cramped, filled with old tinned food and dusty blankets. But on the far wall was a bank of small, outdated CRT monitors connected to the hardwired CCTV system I had installed inside the walls. This was not the modern Wi-Fi connected system Derek controlled on his phone. This was the original closed-circuit loop that ran on an independent power supply. Derek didn't know it existed. He didn't know I could see him. I slumped into the dusty chair in front of the console. My vision was swimming. I wiped the sweat from my eyes and flicked the master switch. The screens hummed to life. Static danced for a moment, gray and fuzzy, before resolving into grainy black and white images of the rooms beyond the wall. My heart hammered against my ribs. I saw the kitchen empty but messy with takeout containers. I saw the hallway. And then I saw the living room. The camera angle was high, looking down from the corner of the ceiling. There he was. Derek. He was sitting on my leather Chesterfield sofa, his feet propped up on the antique coffee table Patricia had spent months restoring. He was wearing my cashmere robe. The audacity of it stole the breath from my lungs. He looked relaxed. He looked comfortable. There was no remorse on his face, no shadow of guilt for the parents he believed were currently being eaten by wolves at the bottom of a ravine. He reached out to the side table and picked up a bottle of wine. I leaned closer to the screen, squinting through the grain. I recognized the label immediately. It was a Chateau Margaux 1996. I had been saving that bottle for his 40th birthday. I had bought it the year he graduated high school, promising myself we would drink it together when he became a man. He poured a glass, swirling the dark liquid casually. He took a sip, closed his eyes, and smiled. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated satisfaction. Beside me, Patricia let out a small, broken sound. It wasn't a sob. It was a growl. She was watching the screen, her hand gripping my shoulder so hard her nails dug into my flesh. "He is drinking your wine," she whispered. "He killed us, and now he is drinking your wine." I watched my son savor the vintage I had saved for him. The image burned itself into my retinas, searing away the fever, searing away the pain, searing away the last remnants of fatherly love. The man on that screen was not my son. He was a parasite, and I was the host who was finally going to purge him. I reached out and adjusted the contrast on the monitor, sharpening the image of his smiling face. "Enjoy it, Derek," I whispered to the glowing screen. "Enjoy the best glass of wine you will ever have, because it is going to be your last." The blue light of the CRT monitors washed over my face, casting long, dancing shadows against the concrete walls of our small sanctuary. Beside me, Patricia huddled under a moth-eaten wool blanket, her eyes glued to the screen with a mixture of horror and fascination. We were like ghosts, haunting our own home, watching the living rearrange the narrative of our existence. Through the hidden ventilation grate that connected the panic room to the main living area, the voices drifted in clearer and more resonant than the tinny audio from the old speakers. I saw the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the living room window before I saw the man himself. It was Sheriff Miller. I knew Jim Miller. We had fished together on weekends. He was a good man, honest and hardworking, but he was not a detective. He was a man who saw the best in people, and right now that virtue was being weaponized against him. He took off his hat as he entered the frame, clutching it to his chest in a gesture of respect that made my stomach turn. He walked carefully across the Persian rug, trying not to track mud into the house of the grieving family. "I am so sorry," Derek Miller said, his voice heavy with sympathy. "We have search and rescue teams out with dogs, but the terrain is brutal. The darkness is not helping." On the screen, the performance began. It was not merely a lie. It was a theater production, and Mallory was the lead actress. She was curled up in the corner of the sofa, clutching a box of tissues to her chest like a lifeline. Her makeup was artfully smeared just enough to suggest hours of weeping without making her look unappealing. "It is all my fault, Sheriff," she wailed. The sound was shrill, piercing through the speaker and stabbing directly into my brain. I should have stopped them. I should have grabbed his arm harder. Patricia let out a sharp hiss of breath beside me. The audacity of the woman. She had not grabbed my arm to save me. She had shoved my back to kill me. Miller sat down on the edge of the coffee table, leaning forward with a comforting hand extended. "Now, Mrs. Thorne, you cannot blame yourself. Accidents happen. Just tell me what happened up there. Take your time." I watched Derek. He was the weak link in their chain of deceit. He was standing by the fireplace, his back to the camera, staring into the unlit hearth. His hands were thrust deep into the pockets of his robe, but I could see his shoulders shaking. To the sheriff, it looked like the tremors of a devastated son trying to hold it together. But I knew that shake. I had seen it when he crashed my sedan when he was 16. I had seen it when he flunked out of his first semester of college. It was not grief. It was fear. Pure, unadulterated terror. He was terrified that the bodies would be found, that some forensic evidence would point to a struggle, that his house of cards would collapse before the check cleared. I turned around, Derek said, his voice trembling. I turned around for 1 second to fix my bootlace. They wanted a picture, a selfie with the sunset. You know how Dad is. He is stubborn. He always wants to get right to the edge for the best view. "Liar," I whispered to the dark room. I was a safety engineer. I spent 40 years lecturing people on job sites about fall protection. I never stood within 6 feet of an unprotected edge in my life. The idea that I would dangle off a cliff for a photograph was an insult to my entire professional career. I told him it was slippery. Mallory chimed in, blowing her nose loudly into a tissue. I said, "Garrett, please step back. The gravel is loose." But he just laughed. He said he wanted to send a picture to his friends at the golf club. And then, oh God. "Sheriff," she buried her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving with practiced sobs. It happened so fast. 1 minute they were smiling, and the next Patricia slipped. She grabbed Garrett's jacket to steady herself, and they just tipped backward. They didn't even scream. Silence filled the panic room. I looked at Patricia. Her face was illuminated by the ghostly glow of the monitor, tears of rage streaming down her cheeks. They were erasing us. They were rewriting our history, turning us into clumsy, reckless old fools who died because of vanity. They were robbing us of our dignity, even as they robbed us of our lives. Sheriff Miller sighed a heavy, mournful sound. He stood up and walked over to Derek, placing a heavy hand on my son's shoulder. "It is a tragedy, son. A terrible tragedy. But you did everything you could. Do not let this weigh on your conscience. Your parents knew you loved them." Derek flinched at the touch. I saw it. It was subtle, a microscopic tightening of the jaw, a slight recoil. He could not handle the validation of a good man because he knew he was rotting from the inside out. "Thank you," Sheriff Derek mumbled, not meeting the man's eyes. When can we declare them, you know?" "We need to follow procedure," Miller said softly. "If the bodies are not recovered within 48 hours, given the conditions, and the witness testimony, we can move to have them declared deceased by misadventure. It will help you then with the insurance and the estate. I know it sounds cold to talk about paperwork now, but I want to make sure you kids are taken care of. Your dad would have wanted that. My dad would have wanted that." The words hung in the air, toxic and bitter. I gripped the armrests of my chair, my knuckles turning white. The urge to smash the glass, to scream through the vents, to bang on the walls and roar, "I am here," was almost overpowering. I wanted to storm out of that secret panel, bloodied and broken, and point a finger at the murderers. but I stopped. I forced my engineer's brain to take over. Look at them, I thought. Look at the scene. If I came out now, what would happen? I was a 72-year-old man with a history of heart medication. I had just suffered a massive head trauma. Derek and Mallory were young, articulate, and currently holding the sympathy of the law. They could say I was delirious. They could say the fall caused brain damage. They could say I attacked them in a fit of dementia. Or worse. Sheriff Miller was armed, but he was alone. If I revealed myself, Derek was desperate enough to do anything. He had already killed his parents in his mind. Would he hesitate to attack a sheriff to cover his tracks? "We are trapped," Patricia whispered, voicing my exact thoughts. "If we go out there now, we lose. They have the narrative, Garrett. They have the story." I leaned back in the dusty chair, the pain in my leg throbbing in time with the pulsing vein in my temple. She was right. We were ghosts, and ghosts cannot testify in court. We needed more than just our presence. We needed indisputable proof. We needed to let them think they had won. We needed to let them get comfortable. Let them sign the papers. Let them dig their own graves so deep that they could never climb out. Sheriff Miller put his hat back on. "I will leave a deputy parked at the end of the driveway tonight, just in case. Try to get some sleep. You two have been through hell." He walked out the front door, taking the safety of the law with him. As the door clicked shut, the performance ended instantly. Mallory dropped the tissue on the floor. She did not wipe her eyes. She stood up, walked to the window, and watched the cruiser pull away. "He bought it," she said, her voice completely devoid of the tremor she had used seconds ago. "He bought every word." Derek collapsed onto the sofa, pouring another glass of my wine, his hands still shaking, but now with relief. "We are clear," he whispered. "We are actually clear." I watched them on the grainy screen, these two strangers living in my house. "Not yet," I murmured. "You are not clear yet." I turned to Patricia. My plan had changed. I did not just want to survive. I wanted to destroy them. I reached for the keyboard of the ancient computer terminal. I needed to see the finances. I needed to see exactly why my son had decided my life was worth trading in. "Let them sleep," I told Patricia, my eyes cold and hard. "Because tomorrow the haunting begins." The house settled into a heavy silence around 3 in the morning. It was the kind of stillness that usually brought me peace, the quiet satisfaction of a home resting after a long day. But tonight, it felt like the held breath of a predator. Inside the panic room, the air was stale and recycled. Patricia had finally drifted into a fitful sleep, her breathing shallow and ragged, her hand twitching occasionally, as if she were still warding off the fall in her dreams. I watched her for a moment, hating myself for not being able to take away her pain, and then I turned my attention to the hidden door. I had to know. The question was burning a hole in my gut like an ulcer. Why? Why would a boy who used to cry when he stepped on a snail grow up to push his own parents off a cliff? I needed to see the monster's logic. I pushed the release lever. The hydraulic hiss seemed deafeningly loud to my heightened senses, but the house remained quiet. I pulled myself out of the narrow opening and into the library. The smell of the room hit me instantly. Old paper lemon polish, and the faint lingering scent of my own pipe tobacco that I had given up years ago. It smelled like safety. It smelled like a lie. My leg was a dead weight, a throbbing anchor of agony that I had to drag across the Persian rug. I did not have crutches. I had to use the furniture, gripping the edges of the mahogany bookshelves, hopping silently on my good foot, sweating with every inch of progress. If Derek woke up, if he came downstairs for a glass of water, if he saw his dead father standing in the shadows, the thought did not scare me as much as it should have. In fact, a dark part of me almost wished he would. I made it to the heavy oak desk in the corner. This used to be my desk. When I retired, I let Derek use it for his real estate ventures. I thought I was passing the torch. I sat down in the leather chair, wincing as my splint hit the leg of the table, and stared at the sleek modern computer monitor. It was asleep. I tapped the spacebar. The screen flared to life, demanding a password. Derek was arrogant. He always had been. He thought he was smarter than me because he knew how to use Instagram, and I still preferred a physical newspaper. But he forgot who wired this house. He forgot who set up the secure server network. He forgot that I was the administrator of the entire system long before he ever touched a keyboard. I did not need his password. I typed in the master override code I had programmed 10 years ago, a string of numbers based on the coordinates of the first bridge I ever built. Access granted. The desktop opened. It was a mess of folders and shortcuts, a digital reflection of my son's chaotic mind. I ignored the games and the social media tabs. I went straight to the financial software. I opened his banking portal. The numbers that filled the screen made my breath hitch in my throat. It was a sea of red. Overdraft fees, maxed out credit cards, withdrawals of $5,000, $10,000, $20,000 at a time. The dates corresponded to the days he had come over for dinner, smiling and telling us how well the market was doing. But where was the money going? I minimized the bank tab and opened a folder labeled simply Projects. Inside, I found the answer. It wasn't real estate. It wasn't development deals. It was crypto. My son had gambled everything. He had leveraged the equity in his own apartment. He had taken out high-interest personal loans, and he had poured it all into obscure, volatile digital coins that had crashed and burned months ago. I scrolled through the transaction history, my engineer's brain trying to make sense of the sheer stupidity of it. He had bought at the peak and sold at the bottom, over and over again. He was chasing losses, digging a hole so deep he could never climb out. I did the math in my head. The total loss was staggering, $2.5 million. He had lost $2.5 million of money he did not have. But banks don't kill you for debt. They just take your house. There was something else. Someone else. I opened his email client. Nothing suspicious there. Just overdue bills and spam. I checked his browser history. Then I saw it. An encrypted messaging app that ran in the background. I clicked it open. The chat log was active. The most recent messages were from a user named Only Viper. The profile picture was a black square. I scrolled up to a week before the hiking trip. Viper wrote, "You are out of time, Derek. The interest has compounded. You owe the principal plus 40%. Derek replied, "I need more time. Please, I have a plan. I just need a few more days to liquidate some assets." Viper, "We do not want assets. We want cash. You have until the end of the month, or we send someone to collect. And we do not collect with a briefcase, we collect with a baseball bat." My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the mouse. This was it. This was the pressure cooker he had been living in. But then I saw the message that stopped my heart. It was dated 3 days ago, the day before he invited us to go to the mountains. Viper wrote, "We know where your parents live. We know they have a nice, secluded cabin. If you do not have the money by next Friday, you are going to go swimming with them. And I do not mean in the pool. I mean with concrete shoes." I stared at the screen. The white text on the black background blurred as tears of rage filled my eyes. There it was. The motive. It wasn't just greed. It was survival. He was terrified. He was cornered like a rat by violent men, and in his desperate, twisted mind, he did not see his parents as people who could help him. He saw us as a piggy bank to be smashed. He had looked at me. He had looked at the father who raised him. And he had calculated that my life insurance and the value of this estate would cover the $2.5 million he owed the mob, with enough left over for him to start fresh. He did not push us off that cliff because he hated us. He pushed us off because we were the collateral for his mistakes. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. No, I realized I didn't have my phone. I grabbed the digital camera that was sitting on the desk, a fancy DSLR he had bought to take pictures of properties he never sold. I turned it on and started taking photos of the screen. Click. The bank statements showing the ruin. Click. The crypto trading logs showing the gambling addiction. Click. The threat from Viper threatening to kill us all. I zoomed in on the last message from Derek to Viper, sent yesterday, after he came back from the cliff. Derek wrote, "It is done. There was an accident. The payout will be in 2 weeks. Back off until then. It is done." That was how he described the murder of his parents. A task completed. A box checked. I sat there in the dark study, the light of the monitor illuminating my tear-stained face. I felt a profound shift inside me. The last tiny ember of hope, the microscopic part of my heart that still wanted to believe this was a misunderstanding, was extinguished forever. I was not a father anymore. I was a structural engineer looking at a building that was too rotten to be saved. There is only one thing you can do with a structure that is compromised to its core. You do not patch it. You do not paint it. You demolish it. I turned off the monitor, plunging the room back into darkness. I gripped the edge of the desk and pulled myself up. The pain in my leg was screaming, but it was nothing compared to the agony in my soul. I had the evidence. I had the motive. I had the weapon. I began the slow, painful drag back to the panic room. I had to show Patricia. I had to show her that the boy she was mourning was already dead. He died the moment he decided that our lives were worth less than his gambling debts. And when I destroy him, I thought as I slipped back through the hidden panel, I won't just be saving ourselves. I will be finishing the job the loan sharks started. But I will do it legally. I will do it publicly. And I will leave him with absolutely nothing. The morning sun filtered through the ventilation shafts, bringing with it a sliver of natural light that felt like a mockery of our imprisonment. Inside the panic room, the air was heavy with the smell of dust and dried blood. My leg was a constant throbbing reminder of my own foolishness, pulsing in time with the second hand of the clock on the wall. We had survived the night, but the day promised new horrors. I sat before the bank of monitors, my eyes gritty with exhaustion, watching the routine of my own household unfold without me. Around 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang. The sound echoed through the speakers, a crisp, cheerful chime that I had installed myself. I watched on the hallway camera as Derek shuffled to the door. He looked terrible. His skin was pale, his eyes sunken, and he was still wearing yesterday's clothes. Guilt and fear were eating him alive, and for a fleeting second I felt a pang of pity. But then I remembered the cliff. I remembered the shove, and the pity evaporated like mist. He opened the door to reveal Robert Hartman. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. Hartman was our family attorney. He was a man I had trusted for 20 years. I had invited him to 4th of July barbecues. I had referred my biggest clients to him. Seeing him there gave me a flicker of hope. Surely he was there to talk sense into Derek. Surely he would notice how erratic my son was acting. I leaned closer to the screen, desperate to hear a voice of reason. Hartman stepped inside, carrying his leather briefcase. He looked professional, serious, the picture of legal competence. "Is she up?" Hartman asked. His voice was low, conspiratorial. In the kitchen, Derek mumbled, "She is making coffee." Hartman nodded and walked past Derek without even shaking his hand. He headed straight for the kitchen. I switched the camera feed, my fingers flying over the console keys. The kitchen camera was positioned above the refrigerator, giving a wide view of the granite island where Patricia and I had shared thousands of breakfasts. Mallory was standing by the coffee maker, her back to the door. When she heard Hartman's footsteps, she turned around. I expected a polite greeting. I expected a discussion about search warrants or insurance claims. Instead, I watched my world fracture for the second time in 3 days. Hartman dropped his briefcase on the floor. Mallory crossed the room in 2 strides. And then right there in the kitchen, where I had taught my son to bake cookies, my daughter-in-law threw her arms around my lawyer's neck and kissed him. It wasn't a friendly kiss. It was passionate. It was hungry. It was the kiss of 2 people who had been intimate for a long time. My jaw literally dropped. I sat frozen in the dark, my mind struggling to process the image on the grainy screen. Beside me, Patricia gasped a sharp intake of air that sounded like she had been stabbed. They separated, but Hartman kept his hands on her waist. He looked down at her with a smirk that made my skin crawl. "Did he suspect anything?" Hartman asked, tilting his head toward the living room where Derek was pacing. "He is a wreck," Mallory scoffed, pouring 2 cups of coffee. "He is crying every 5 minutes. He is terrified of the police. He thinks he is the mastermind, Rob." "It is pathetic," Hartman laughed. It was a cold, cruel sound. "Let him cry, it makes him look innocent. The more unstable he looks, the better it is for us." I stared at the screen, my blood running cold. Us. There was no Derek in that equation. I listened intently as they leaned against the counter, sipping my coffee, discussing the fate of my family. "The timeline is tight," Hartman said, blowing on his drink. "I have fast-tracked the death certificate application. Sheriff Miller is already on board with the accident theory. Once the paperwork is filed, the insurance company will release the funds within 10 days. That is $4 million plus the liquidation of the real estate." "Derek needs that money for the loan sharks," Mallory said, rolling her eyes. "He is going to hand almost $3 million of it over to those thugs the moment the check clears." Hartman smiled, reaching out to stroke her cheek. "That is the beauty of it, darling. We let him pay the debts. We let him clean up the mess. We let him get the mob off his back. And then he becomes the grieving son who couldn't handle the tragedy." Mallory finished the sentence, a wicked smile playing on her lips. "Exactly," Hartman whispered. "A tragic overdose. Or maybe a carbon monoxide accident in the garage. He is already distraught. He has a history of depression. Who would question it? The grieving son joins his parents. It is poetic, really." I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. This was the second layer of the trap. Derek thought he was the player, but he was just a pawn. He had killed his parents to save his own skin, not realizing he was digging his own grave. Mallory and Hartman were not just stealing my money. They were using my son as a disposable tool to launder the inheritance before discarding him like trash. Hartman pulled her close again. "And then the widow inherits everything. No parents, no husband. Just you, me, and $6 million on a beach in the Cayman Islands." They kissed again, sealing the pact of double murder. I sat back in my chair, trembling. The betrayal was total. There was no one left. The law, the family, the friends, everyone was either a wolf or a sheep being led to the slaughter. I looked at Derek on the other monitor, sitting alone in the living room, staring at his hands. He was a murderer, yes. He had pushed me. But in that moment, seeing the knife hovering over his unsuspecting back, I felt a strange, twisted surge of protective instinct. He was my son. He was a monster, but he was my monster. And these 2 interlopers were planning to butcher him. I turned to Patricia, expecting to see her weeping. I expected to see the broken mother who had been sobbing over her son's lost soul. But the woman sitting next to me was dry-eyed. She was sitting on a crate of emergency rations, her back straight, her face illuminated by the blue light of the monitors. In her hands, she held a small paring knife we had found in the supply kit. It was dull, cheap metal. She picked up a loose piece of concrete from the unfinished floor of the panic room. Scrape. 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 The sound was rhythmic and chilling. She was sharpening the blade. "Patricia!" I whispered, a little afraid of the look in her eyes. She didn't look at me. She kept her eyes glued to the screen, watching Mallory laugh at something Hartman said. "They are not taking him," she said softly. Her voice was devoid of emotion, stripped of all warmth. It was the voice of a judge pronouncing a death sentence. "Derek is ours to punish Garrett. I brought him into this world. I failed to raise him right. And now he has failed us. But he belongs to us." Scrape, scrape, scrape. She tested the edge of the knife with her thumb. A thin line of red blood appeared on her skin. She didn't flinch. "That woman," Patricia said, pointing the knife at Mallory's image on the screen. "She sat at my table. She called me Mom. And now she plans to kill my son after she made him kill me." She turned to me then, and the fire in her eyes was terrifying. It was not the fire of madness. It was the cold blue flame of absolute resolve. "We are not just going to send them to prison, Garrett. We are going to break them. We are going to make them turn on each other." I want to see the fear in her eyes that she put in Derek's. I looked at the knife, then at the screen, and then back to my wife. The gentle nurse was gone. The loving grandmother was gone. In their place sat a warrior who had realized that mercy was a luxury we could no longer afford. "You are right," I said, reaching out to cover her hand, stopping the sharpening motion. "We will break them. But we won't use a knife. We have something better." I pointed to the computer terminal. "We have the truth, and we are going to feed it to them one drop at a time until they drown in it." I looked back at the screen where Hartman was now checking his watch, preparing to leave. He looked so confident, so untouchable. "Go ahead, Robert," I thought. "File the papers. Set the trap. You think you are the hunter. But you have no idea that you are locked in a cage with 2 lions you thought were dead. And the lions are hungry." The panic room was silent, except for the low hum of the ventilation system and the rhythmic scratching of Patricia's knife against the concrete floor. She had stopped sharpening it hours ago, but she kept moving the blade back and forth, a hypnotic motion that told me she was deep in thought, planning, calculating. I turned away from the monitors where the image of my empty living room flickered in black and white. We had seen enough. We knew the players. We knew the stakes. Now we needed an army. I limped over to the metal locker in the corner of the room. My leg was stiff, the swelling straining against the leather belt I had used as a tourniquet, but the pain had become a dull, constant companion that I could ignore. I spun the combination lock. Left to 30, right to 15, left to 9. The heavy door creaked open, revealing shelves stocked with MRE's water jugs, and on the top shelf, a heavy dust-covered Pelican case. I pulled it down and popped the latches. Inside lay a brick of black plastic that looked like a relic from a museum. It was an Iridium satellite phone, a piece of technology I had bought 30 years ago when I was working on infrastructure projects in the Middle East. It was clunky, heavy, and obsolete by modern standards, but it had one advantage that the sleek smartphones upstairs did not possess. It did not rely on local cell towers. It beamed its signal directly to space, bypassing the local grid, untraceable and unstoppable. I pulled out the antenna and pressed the power button. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then a small green light flickered. The monochrome screen woke up, searching for signal. I moved closer to the air intake vent, holding the device up like an offering to the gods of communication. 1 bar. 2 bars. Patricia looked up from her knife. "Who are you calling?" she asked softly. "The only man I know who hates lawyers more than I do," I replied. I dialed a number I had memorized 3 decades ago. It was a number I had never had to call for help, but one I knew would always be answered. The line rang. Once. Twice. 3 times. "Yeah," a gruff voice answered. It sounded tired, gravelly, the voice of a man who had seen too much of the world's darkness. "Frank," I said. "It is Garrett." There was a long silence on the other end. I could hear the background noise of a television, the low murmur of a news anchor, probably talking about the tragic disappearance of the Thorne couple. "Who is this?" Frank asked. His voice had dropped an octave. It was dangerous now. "It is Garrett Thorne, Frank." "Don't play with me," the voice growled. "I am watching the news right now. Garrett Thorne is dead. He fell off a cliff 2 days ago. If this is some kind of sick prank, I will trace this call and I will come over there and break your jaw." I took a deep breath. "Ask me about the tunnel, Frank. Ask me about the collapses in '92. Ask me who dug you out of 3 tons of wet concrete with his bare hands when the shoring failed." The silence that followed was heavy. I could hear Frank's breathing change. It became shallow, rapid. I could almost see him sitting in his armchair in Chicago, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the phone. "Garrett," he whispered. "Jesus Christ, you are a ghost." "I am not a ghost yet, Frank," I said. "But I am working on it. I need your help." "You are alive," he shouted, the relief crashing into anger. "Where are you? I am calling the bureau. I will have a chopper there in 20 minutes. I will get the local PD to kick down the door." "No," I cut him off sharp and loud. "Do not call the police. The police are already compromised. They think it was an accident. And Frank, my son, is in the house." "Derek?" Frank asked, confused. "Is he holding you hostage?" I looked at Patricia. She was watching me, her eyes hard as flint. "No," I said. "He pushed us, Frank. He pushed us off the ledge. He and his wife. And now they are upstairs drinking my wine and planning how to spend the insurance money." I heard a sound on the other end that sounded like glass breaking. Frank had probably just thrown his drink against the wall. "He pushed you," Frank roared. His voice was trembling with a rage that matched my own. "That little boy I used to buy ice cream for. He tried to kill you. He owes money, Frank. A lot of money to bad people. And his wife is sleeping with my lawyer, Robert Hartman. They are all in on it. They are going to cash the check and then get rid of Derek, too." I quickly explained the situation. The fall, the survival, the panic room, the cameras, the double cross. I told him everything. By the time I finished, Frank was not shouting anymore. He was deadly quiet. That was when Frank was most dangerous. He was an ex-FBI field agent who had spent his career taking down organized crime syndicates. He knew how to dismantle people's lives piece by piece. "What do you need?" Frank asked. "Just say the word. I have friends in private security. I can have a team of operators at your perimeter by midnight. We can breach the house, secure the targets, and have them zip-tied before they wake up." I considered it. It would be easy. It would be safe. We could walk out of this room and let men with guns handle our son. But then I looked at my leg. I looked at the blood on Patricia's forehead. This was not a tactical operation. This was a family matter. "No teams, Frank," I said. "I want them to think they have won. I want them to sign the papers. I want them to stand in front of everyone and claim that money." "You want to trap them," Frank realized. "I want to destroy them," I corrected. "I need you to handle the legal side. I need you to freeze the assets from the outside without tripping any alarms. I need you to contact the insurance company privately and tell them to flag the claim but play along. And I need you to get a copy of the autopsy report for the baby Mallory claims she is carrying. I have a feeling the DNA will not match my son." "I can do that," Frank said. "I still have contacts at the district attorney's office. I can get a subpoena sealed. I can make sure that when they try to withdraw a single cent, the bank vault slams shut on their fingers." "Good," I said. "And Frank, one more thing. I need you to come here." "I am already packing a bag," Frank said. "I will be there tomorrow. I will act as the insurance investigator. I will walk right through the front door and shake his hand. Be careful," I warned. "They are desperate." "Desperate is good," Frank said darkly. "Desperate people make mistakes. You just stay alive down there, Garrett. Keep Patricia safe. I am coming, and I am bringing the sledgehammer." I lowered the phone. The connection severed, but the lifeline held. I felt a weight lift off my chest. We were not alone anymore. We had a wolf of our own now, and he was coming to the door. I turned to Patricia. "Frank is in," I said. She nodded slowly, setting the knife down on the crate. "Good," she said, "because I was just thinking about the memorial service Derek is planning." "What about it?" I asked. She looked at the calendar on the wall marking the days. "If we are going to return from the dead, Garrett, we should pick a dramatic moment. Why crash a party when you can crash your own funeral?" I looked at her, and for the first time in 3 days, I smiled. It was a grim, humorless smile, but it was there. "You want to walk in during the eulogy?" I asked. "I want to hear what he has to say about us before we send him to prison," she replied. "I want to give him every chance to confess, every chance to show a shred of humanity. And when he fails, I want to be standing there to watch his soul leave his body." I walked back to the monitors. Derek was asleep on the sofa now, twitching in a nightmare. "Sleep tight, son," I thought. "Your Uncle Frank is coming to visit, and he plays much rougher than I do." The next afternoon brought a surreal kind of torture that I had not anticipated. It is one thing to know your son is trying to steal your life, but it is another thing entirely to watch him bury you while you are still breathing. From the narrow, reinforced window of the basement level just above the garden soil line, Patricia and I had a front-row seat to our own funeral. It was a memorial service technically, since there were no bodies to bury. Derek had moved with lightning speed. He claimed it was to help the community heal, to provide closure before the search was officially called off, but I knew the truth. He needed the public spectacle. He needed the obituary in the paper, and the witnesses at the wake to cement the narrative of the tragic accident. If enough people cried for us, then we must truly be dead. I watched the cars arrive through the tint of the privacy glass. Black sedans and SUVs lined the driveway I had paved last summer. I saw people I had known for decades stepping out clutching handkerchiefs and casseroles. There was Larry, my old foreman from the Department of Transportation, a man who had never cried in 40 years of pouring concrete, wiping his eyes as he walked up the path. There was Sarah, our neighbor, who exchanged zucchini bread with Patricia every Christmas. Seeing their genuine grief felt like a physical blow. I wanted to tap on the glass. I wanted to shout, "I am here, Larry. I am not dead. We are just downstairs." But I stayed silent. We had to stay silent. Patricia was pressed against me, her body trembling. She wasn't looking at the friends, though. She was looking at the small boy standing near the podium. It was Leo. My grandson. Derek's son from his first marriage. He was 7 years old, wearing a suit that was slightly too small for him, looking completely lost in the sea of black-clad adults. He was holding a single white rose. His mother, Derek's ex-wife, was nowhere to be seen, likely sidelined by Derek's aggressive legal maneuvering, so the boy was alone. I watched as Leo stepped toward the large easel that held a blown-up photograph of Patricia and me. It was a picture from our 40th anniversary. We looked so happy in that photo, so oblivious to the viper nest we were nurturing. Leo reached out to place the rose on the easel ledge. Then Mallory stepped into the frame. She did not hug him. She did not comfort the child, who had just lost his grandparents. She grabbed his wrist. It was a sharp, aggressive motion. I saw her lips move, her face contorted in a snarl that the guests behind her could not see. She yanked the rose out of his hand and tossed it onto a nearby table as if it were trash. She pointed a manicured finger at a chair in the back row, banishing him to the fringe of the event. That witch Patricia hissed, her voice vibrating with a rage I had never heard before. She is not letting him near the photo. She does not want him ruining her aesthetic. My heart broke for the boy. Leo looked down at his empty hands, his shoulders slumping. He didn't cry. He just looked small and defeated. He was the only person in that garden who shared my blood aside from his father, and he was being treated like a prop in a stage play. Then the main act began. Derek walked up to the microphone. He was wearing a black suit that I recognized. It was my suit. He had raided my closet because he was too cheap to buy his own. The jacket was a little loose in the shoulders, hanging off him like the lie he was living. He tapped the microphone. Feedback whined through the garden speakers, causing a few guests to wince. "Thank you all for coming," Derek said. His voice was thick with emotion, a performance worthy of an Oscar. I turned up the volume on the surveillance feed so we could hear every word clearly in our hiding hole. "My father, Garrett Thorne, was a man of integrity," Derek began. He paused to wipe a non-existent tear from his cheek. "He taught me everything I know about strength, about honor. He used to tell me that a man is defined by how he protects his family." I felt bile rise in my throat. The hypocrisy was so dense it was suffocating. He was using my own maxims, the lessons I had tried to instill in him, over fishing trips and workbench sessions to cover up the fact that he had tried to murder me for a crypto debt. And my mother, Derek, continued, his voice cracking. "Patricia was the heart of this home. She was an angel who walked among us. I take comfort in knowing that they are together now, looking down on us. I know they would want us to move forward. They would want us to be happy. They would not want us to dwell on the tragedy, but to celebrate the legacy they left behind." Legacy. That was the code word. Legacy meant money. Legacy meant the house, the cars, the investments. He was telling the crowd that the best way to honor us was to let him spend our fortune in peace. He looked out over the crowd, practicing the mournful gaze he must have rehearsed in the mirror. "I promise you, Dad, Mom, I will take care of everything," he said, looking up at the sky. "I will make you proud." I looked at his hands gripping the podium. They were shaking. Not from grief, but from the adrenaline of the con. He was terrified that someone would ask a hard question. He was terrified that the wind would blow too hard and knock over his house of cards. Patricia grabbed my hand. Her fingernails dug into my palm, drawing blood. I didn't pull away. The physical pain was grounding. It kept me from smashing the window. "Did you hear him, Garrett?" she whispered. "He is making us into saints so he can spend the devil's money." I looked at my son. I looked at the boy who I had held in my arms minutes after he was born. I looked at the man who had looked me in the eye and pushed me into the void. I leaned my forehead against the cold glass of the basement window. "You want a legacy, Derek," I whispered to the glass. "I will give you a legacy." I watched him step down from the podium, accepting hugs from my friends, nodding solemnly as they patted his back. He looked relieved. He thought the hard part was over. He thought the public display was the final hurdle before the check cleared. He had no idea that the man he was eulogizing was 10 feet away, watching his every move, dissecting his every lie. I squeezed Patricia's hand back, ignoring the blood that was now slick between our palms. "Let him have his moment," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "Let him feel safe. Let him think the world is on his side. Because when we walk into that room tomorrow, I want the fall to be just as high for him as it was for us." I watched Mallory join him, sliding her arm through his. She whispered something in his ear, and for a split second, I saw Derek smile. It was a small, greedy smile. "Wait for it, son," I thought. "Just you wait. My speech is going to be a hell of a lot better than yours, and I won't need a microphone to make everyone listen." The morning of the third day brought a visitor who did not carry a casserole or a tear-stained handkerchief. From my vantage point in the panic room, sitting before the glowing blue monitors, I watched a black sedan pull up the driveway. It was not a police cruiser, and it was not a hearse. It was a sleek, expensive luxury car that screamed corporate authority. The man who stepped out of it was someone I had known for 30 years, but even I barely recognized him. Frank had shed his worn leather jacket and the weary slouch of a retired federal agent. In their place, he wore a charcoal 3-piece suit that cost more than Derek's car. His silver hair was slicked back, and he carried a leather briefcase with the kind of casual arrogance that only high-powered attorneys and seasoned hitmen possess. He looked like a shark that had just smelled blood in the water. I nudged Patricia, who was dozing lightly on the cot. She sat up instantly, her eyes darting to the screen. "It is showtime," I whispered. I watched on the camera feed as Derek opened the door. My son looked worse than he had the day before. The adrenaline of the funeral had worn off, leaving him with the jittery exhaustion of a man waiting for the other shoe to drop. He squinted at Frank, confused. "Mr. Thorne." Frank said, his voice smooth and projecting a practiced professional warmth. "My name is Frank Sterling. I am the senior claims adjuster for Sovereign Life Insurance. I apologize for the intrusion so soon after your loss." Derek's posture changed instantly. The fear evaporated, replaced by a sudden sharp alertness. The mention of the insurance company acted like a shot of caffeine to his system. He straightened his spine and opened the door wider. "Please come in," Derek said, trying to smooth down his rumpled shirt. "I was expecting to hear from you, but not in person." Frank stepped into the foyer, his eyes scanning the room. I knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't admiring the architecture. He was clearing the corners, checking for threats, mapping the exits. It was muscle memory from a lifetime of kicking down doors masked by a corporate smile. "This is a high-value policy," Mr. Thorne, Frank explained as he walked into the living room. $4 million is a significant sum. Typically, these claims take months to process, especially with the complications regarding the recovery of the remains. I saw Derek's throat bob as he swallowed hard. Complications. That was the word he feared most. However, Frank continued, setting his briefcase on the coffee table and snapping the latches open with a loud click. Sovereign Life prides itself on supporting families in times of crisis. Given the sheriff's report and the witness testimonies, the board has decided to expedite the claim. "We want to help you move forward, Derek." Mallory appeared from the kitchen then. She must have been listening from the hallway, because she moved with a predatory speed. She walked right up to the table, her eyes locked on the paperwork Frank was spreading out. "Expedite?" she asked, her voice breathless. "What does that mean exactly?" Frank pulled a fountain pen from his pocket. "It means the funds have been approved for release. The check has been cut. It is sitting in my office safe right now." I watched Derek and Mallory exchange a look. It was a look of pure, unadulterated greed. It was electric. They didn't look at each other with love. They looked at each other like accomplices who had just pulled off the heist of the century. They thought they had gotten away with it. They thought the universe was rewarding them for their cruelty. "There is just one procedural hurdle," Frank said, dropping the bait. The air in the room froze. Mallory's smile faltered. "What hurdle?" she snapped, a little too aggressively. Frank didn't flinch. He looked at her with a calm, steady gaze. "The policy stipulates that for an expedited payout in the absence of a death certificate, all beneficiaries and legal heirs must sign a waiver of liability in the presence of the estate executor. It is a formality to protect the company from future lawsuits." "We can sign right now," Derek said, reaching for the pen. "I am afraid it has to be done formally," Frank said, pulling the document back slightly. "I understand there is a reading of the will scheduled for tomorrow morning with your family attorney, Mr. Hartman." "Yes," Mallory said, "at 10 o'clock. "Perfect." Frank smiled. "I will bring the check to the reading. Once the will is read and the waivers are signed, I will hand over the funds immediately. You will walk out of that room tomorrow with $4 million. Derek slumped onto the sofa, letting out a long, ragged breath that sounded like a laugh. "Tomorrow. It is over tomorrow." "I will see you then," Frank said. He stood up, buttoned his jacket, and walked to the door. He didn't shake their hands. He didn't offer condolences. He just walked out, cool as ice. As the door closed, I waited. I wanted to see what they would do when they thought they were alone. The reaction was immediate and disgusting. Derek leaped off the sofa and let out a whoop of joy that shook the walls. Mallory screamed and jumped into his arms. They spun around in the living room, laughing, cheering, celebrating the payout for my death. "We did it," Derek yelled. "We actually did it. 4 million. Plus the house. Plus the portfolio. I am rich, Mal. We are rich." Mallory kissed him hard. "I told you," she said. "I told you we just had to stick to the plan. I told you nobody would look too closely. They are just two old people who fell off a rock. Nobody cares." I felt Patricia's hand on my shoulder. It was heavy and hot. I looked at her. She wasn't watching the screen anymore. She was staring at the floor, her face a mask of stone. "Nobody cares," she repeated Mallory's words. "That is what she thinks." On the screen, Derek ran to the kitchen and came back with a bottle of champagne. It wasn't mine this time. It was a cheap bottle they must have bought themselves, anticipating this moment. He popped the cork. Foam spilled onto the Persian rug, my rug, and he didn't even care. He laughed and took a swig straight from the bottle. To Garrett and Patricia, he toasted, raising the bottle to the ceiling. "Thanks for the donation, Mom and Dad. Sorry you had to take the expressway down, but hey, at least you are useful to me now." That broke me. It didn't break me in the way that makes you cry. It broke the last tether of humanity I had attached to him. The son I loved died in that moment, drowned in cheap champagne and cheaper greed. "Turn it off, Garrett," Patricia said quietly. "We have seen enough. We have work to do. I killed the feed." The room plunged into semi-darkness. We did not sleep that night. There was no point. The adrenaline was coursing through our veins, a cold metallic fuel that sharpened every sense. We spent the hours preparing for our resurrection. Usually before a big event, a will reading or a wedding, we would shower. We would shave. We would put on our Sunday best. Patricia would wear her pearls. I would wear my navy suit. We would present ourselves as the respectable, dignified couple everyone knew. But not this time. I went to the corner of the panic room, where we had piled the clothes we were wearing when we fell. My flannel shirt was torn to ribbons, the left sleeve completely missing the chest, stiff with dried blood and pine sap. My jeans were shredded at the knees, caked with mud from the crawl through the swamp. One boot was missing its laces, which were currently holding my leg bone together. Patricia's cardigan was in even worse shape. It was stained dark brown with the blood from her head wound. Her blouse was ripped, exposing the bruises on her shoulder. "Put them on," Patricia said. I looked at her. She was already stripping off the spare shirt she had found in the emergency kit. She picked up the blood-crusted blouse. She didn't wince as she pulled it on. She buttoned it up with a grim determination, like a knight donning armor. "We are not going to a funeral, Garrett," she said, her voice echoing in the small concrete room. "We are going to a crime scene, and we are the evidence." I understood then. If we walked in there clean and bandaged, we would just be survivors. We would be victims asking for pity. But if we walked in there wearing the blood they spilled, wearing the dirt from the grave they dug for us, we would be nightmares. We would be the physical manifestation of their guilt. I pulled on my torn shirt. The dried blood scratched my skin. The smell of the forest, damp earth, sweat, and copper filled my nose. It was a horrible smell. It was the smell of death. I looked at my leg. The makeshift splint was ugly, a bundle of sticks and belts. I adjusted it, gritting my teeth against the flare of pain. I grabbed the crude crutch I had fashioned from an old broom handle I found in the supply locker. Patricia stood before me. She had taken a little bit of water and mixed it with the dust from the floor, smearing it on her cheeks to replicate the grime of the trek. She undid the bandage on her head, revealing the angry, jagged scab of the gash. It looked horrific. "How do I look?" she asked. "You look terrifying," I said honestly. "Good," she nodded. We sat there in the dark, two revenants, waiting for the dawn. Upstairs, the champagne was flowing, and the dreams of yachts and sports cars were dancing in their heads. They were sleeping soundly in my bed, secure in their victory. They didn't know that beneath the floorboards, the corpses were getting dressed. We waited as the hours ticked by. 4 a.m., 5 a.m., 6 a.m. When the sun finally began to rise, casting a pale gray light through the vents, I stood up. I checked the charge on the taser I had taken from the security locker. I put the digital recorder with the confession tape in my pocket. "It is time," I said. Patricia stood up beside me. She didn't look like an old woman anymore. She looked like an avenging angel who had crawled out of hell with a sword in her hand. "Let's go say hello to the family," she whispered. We moved toward the secret panel. The setup was complete. The trap was sprung. All that was left was to close the jaws. The library was pitch black save for the thin sliver of light cutting under the doorframe. The air around us was thick with the scent of old paper and the metallic tang of the dried blood on our clothes. I stood there in the darkness, leaning heavily on my makeshift broom-handle crutch, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on my shoulders. Patricia was beside me, her breathing steady and rhythmic, a warrior preparing for the final charge. We were separated from the people who tried to kill us by only 2 inches of oak, yet the distance felt like an eternity. Through the wood, the sounds of the living room drifted in. I could hear the rustle of suits, the clinking of china cups, and the low murmur of voices. It was 10 o'clock in the morning. The stage was set. I pressed my ear against the cool wood of the door panel. I could picture the scene perfectly. They would be sitting in a semicircle. Derek and Mallory on the sofa trying to look somber, but vibrating with the energy of lottery winners. Sheriff Miller in the armchair, uncomfortable in his uniform, holding his hat in his lap. Hartman at the head of the coffee table arranging his documents like a conductor preparing an orchestra. And Frank, my old friend Frank, would be standing near the fireplace, the wolf in sheep's clothing, guarding the check that was never going to be cashed. "Let us begin!" Hartman's voice boomed. It was a voice I had paid thousands of dollars for over the years, a voice that was supposed to protect my interests. Now it was the voice of my executioner. I heard the shuffle of papers. "As you know," Hartman continued, "the circumstances of Garrett and Patricia's disappearance are tragic. However, the law requires us to be pragmatic. Given the expedited status of the insurance claim and the consensus regarding the accident, we are proceeding with the assumption of death to facilitate the transfer of the estate." I waited for someone to object. I waited for Derek to say, "Stop. That is my father you are talking about." But there was only silence. A greedy, hungry silence. Hartman began to read the terms. "I, Garrett Thorne, being of sound mind and body, hereby bequeath my entire estate, including all real property, the investment portfolio currently held at Chase Bank, and all personal effects to my only son, Derek Thorne." I heard a sharp intake of breath from the sofa. It was Derek. He was hyperventilating. The numbers were becoming real to him. He wasn't hearing words. He was hearing freedom from the loan sharks. He was hearing the engine of a new Porsche. He was hearing the applause of the friends he had lied to. Furthermore, Hartman droned on his voice, devoid of any real emotion. "The contents of the safety deposit box, the vintage car collection, and the patent royalties are to be transferred immediately upon signature of this affidavit." Mallory cleared her throat. "And the insurance?" she asked. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the legal jargon. She didn't care about my patents. She didn't care about the cars. She wanted the cash. "Mr. Sterling has the check right here," Hartman said, sounding annoyed at the interruption, but remaining professional. I imagined Frank nodding slowly, patting his breast pocket. "That is correct," Frank said. His voice was calm, authoritative. $4 million payable to the estate of Garrett Thorne. As soon as the waivers are signed and witnessed by the sheriff, the check is yours." The tension in the room was palpable even through the door. I could feel it vibrating in the floorboards. This was it. The moment they had killed for. The moment they had damned their souls for. Sheriff Miller spoke up then. His voice was heavy, filled with a genuine sadness that made my chest ache. I just want to say, Derek, that your dad was a good man. I remember when he helped build the community center. He didn't charge the town a dime. He just wanted the kids to have a safe place to play. I hope you honor that memory, son. There was a pause. I knew Derek was struggling to find the right face to wear. I will, Sheriff Derek said. His voice wavered, but not with grief. It wavered with impatience. He just wanted the man to stop talking so he could get the money. I will build a garden. In their name. A garden. He was going to build a garden with blood money. Patricia gripped my arm in the dark. Her fingernails dug into my bicep through the torn flannel shirt. I knew she was thinking about her rose bushes, the ones she had tended for 20 years, the ones Derek would probably bulldoze to put in a swimming pool. Okay, Hartman said, sensing the impatience in the room. Let us conclude this. I have the affidavit of survivorship and the waiver of liability here. Derek, you sign first. Then Mallory. Then the sheriff will witness. I heard the scratch of a pen being uncapped. It was a distinctive sound. It was my fountain pen. I had left it on the desk. Hartman was letting my son use my own favorite pen to sign away my life. Sign right there, Hartman instructed. On the dotted line. I closed my eyes. I could see it. The nib of the pen hovering over the paper. The ink that would seal our fate. The final nail in the coffin. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. This was the edge of the cliff all over again. But this time I wasn't falling. I was jumping. Wait. The word cracked through the room like a whip. It wasn't Derek. It wasn't Hartman. It was Frank. I opened my eyes in the dark. Here we go. What is the problem, Mr. Sterling? Hartman asked, his voice dripping with irritation. We are in the middle of a legal proceeding. I apologize, Frank said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. But there is a procedural error. Error, Mallory snapped. What error? The paperwork is perfect. You said it was approved. The claim is approved, Frank said smoothly. But in cases of expedited payouts involving high-net-worth individuals, there is often a supplementary clause in the policy, a clause that allows for a final statement from the policyholder. Hartman laughed. A final statement. The policyholder is dead, Mr. Sterling. Unless you have a Ouija board in that briefcase, I suggest you let my client sign the document. I do not have a Ouija board, Frank replied. His voice dropped. It became cold. It became dangerous. But I do have Clause 414B, the testator's privilege. It states that before the assets are transferred, the deceased must be given the floor. The room went silent. I could feel the confusion radiating from them. They were looking at Frank like he was insane. That is absurd, Derek said, his voice trembling. My dad is dead. He is at the bottom of a canyon. How can he have the floor? Frank didn't answer him. Instead, he took 2 steps across the Persian rug. I could hear his heavy footsteps approaching the library door. He stopped right on the other side. Actually, Frank said, raising his voice so it echoed off the vaulted ceiling. The clause is quite specific. It says that the truth must be heard. And sometimes the truth doesn't come from a piece of paper. Sometimes it walks through the door. Frank knocked on the wood. 3 sharp raps. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was thunderous in the silent house. I looked at Patricia. In the faint light from the crack, her eyes were blazing. She nodded once. I reached out with my trembling hand and gripped the brass knob. It was cold under my palm. My leg was screaming in pain, but I forced myself to stand tall. I shifted my weight to the crutch. I turned the handle. Click. The latch disengaged. The sound was small, mechanical, but in that room it must have sounded like a gunshot. I didn't open it quickly. I didn't burst in. I wanted them to suffer. I wanted them to watch the impossible unfold in slow motion. I pushed. The heavy oak door swung inward. I had not oiled these hinges in years. As the door moved, the metal groaned. It was a high-pitched, screeching wail that rose in pitch as the gap widened. Screech! It sounded like a coffin lid opening. It sounded like a scream from the grave. The light from the living room flooded into the library, blinding me for a second. I blinked my eyes, adjusting to the brightness. The dust motes danced in the shaft of light, swirling around us like a halo. As the door fully opened, revealing the two of us standing in the threshold, the silence in the living room was shattered. It wasn't a scream. It was the sound of air being sucked out of the room. It was the sound of 4 hearts stopping at the exact same time. I stood there, framed by the darkness behind me. I was covered in mud. My shirt was torn and bloody. My leg was wrapped in dirty sticks and belts. Beside me, Patricia looked like a specter of vengeance, the dried blood on her forehead looking like war paint. I looked directly at Derek. He was holding the pen. He was frozen, his mouth hanging open, his eyes bulging out of his head. He looked at me then, he looked at the check, then back at me. His brain could not process what he was seeing. I took a step forward. The crutch hit the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. Thump. I cleared my throat. My voice was raspy, damaged from the cold nights and the screaming silence, but it was steady. I believe I said, looking straight into the terrified eyes of my son, "That is my pen you are holding, and I am not done using it yet." The light from the living room stung my eyes, but I did not blink. I wanted to see everything. I wanted to capture every micro-expression of terror that was about to wash over the people who had celebrated my death. I stepped fully into the room, the heavy oak door creaking shut behind Patricia, sealing the library and the secret exit. We stood there like 2 revenants dredged up from the bottom of a swamp, a grotesque mirror image of the polished, wealthy couple they thought they had buried. The silence that had fallen over the room was absolute, a vacuum, where sound used to exist. It lasted for perhaps 3 seconds, but in my mind, it stretched for an hour. I saw the blood drain from Mallory's face. It didn't just fade. It vanished, leaving her skin the color of old parchment. Her eyes, usually so sharp and calculating, went wide and vacant, staring at the gash on Patricia's forehead as if it were the gate to hell itself. Then the scream tore her throat apart. It was not a human sound. It was the primal shriek of a cornered animal realizing the trap has snapped shut. Mallory scrambled backward, her heels catching on the thick Persian rug. She lost her balance and toppled over the arm of the sofa, crashing onto the floor in a heap of tangled limbs and expensive fabric. She didn't try to stand up. She just crab-walked backward on her hands and heels, kicking at the air, trying to put distance between herself and the ghosts standing in the doorway. "Get away!" she screeched, her voice cracking into hysteria. "Get away from me! You are dead! You are dead!" Hartman, the man of steel composure, the man who could negotiate $1,000,000 settlements without blinking, simply fell apart. He was holding my Mont Blanc fountain pen poised to sign the theft of my legacy. His hand went limp. The pen slipped from his fingers and hit the hardwood floor. It rolled in a small, pathetic circle, coming to rest against his polished shoe. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock, but no words came out. His legal mind, built on logic and precedent, had no defense against the impossible. But my eyes were fixed on Derek. My son. The boy I had carried on my shoulders. The man who had pushed me. He had not moved. He was still sitting on the edge of the sofa, his hand frozen in midair where he had been reaching for the pen. He looked at me and I saw the years strip away from his face. He wasn't a 38-year-old businessman anymore. He was 6 years old again, terrified because he had broken a window. Then I smelled it. A sharp, acrid scent of ammonia cutting through the smell of expensive coffee and my own forest grime. I looked down at his trousers. A dark stain was spreading rapidly across the crotch of my stolen suit pants, soaking into the fabric, dripping onto the cushion of the sofa. He had lost control of his bladder. It was a cruel, visceral detail, a callback to his childhood, when fear would paralyze him. But this time, I felt no urge to comfort him. I felt no instinct to tell him it was okay. I just watched the stain spread, a physical manifestation of his cowardice. I took another step forward. Thump, drag, thump. The sound of the broom handle hitting the floor echoed like a judge's gavel. I stopped 3 feet away from him. I loomed over him, letting him smell the mud on my clothes, letting him see the splinters in the wood tied to my broken leg. I did not shout. Shouting is for men who are not sure of their power. I had all the power in the world right now. "Hello, son," I whispered. My voice was a wreck. It was rasping, grinding, sounding like 2 stones rubbing together. But it carried to every corner of the room. 40 meters is a long way down, isn't it? I asked, leaning in closer. But evidently it was not deep enough to keep us there. Derek began to shake. It started in his hands and took over his whole body, a violent tremor that made his teeth chatter. He looked up at me, his eyes wet, pleading, desperate. "Dad," he stammered. The word sounded foreign in his mouth. "Dad, it was an accident." I stared at him. Even now, even with the mud of the grave standing in front of him, he was still lying. I slipped. Derek babbled, the words tumbling out over each other. "I tried to grab you. I swear. I tried to grab Mom. It was slippery. I was scared. I didn't know what to do." He looked at the sheriff, seeking an ally. "Tell him, Sheriff." I was devastated. "I have been crying for days. I thought you were gone. I was just trying to follow your wishes." Mallory, still on the floor, seized onto the lie. "Yes," she cried out, pulling herself up to her knees. "It was a terrible accident, Garrett. We were in shock. We were going to use the money to build a memorial. We loved you." Patricia stepped forward then. She didn't have a crutch. She didn't need one. She walked with a terrifying grace, her bloodied head held high. She looked down at Mallory with a cold, clinical detachment. "A memorial?" Patricia asked softly. "Is that what you call a beach house in the Cayman Islands?" Mallory froze. Hartman flinched. They realized then that we knew. We knew everything. Derek tried one last time. "Dad, please. You are confused. The fall. You hit your head. You are imagining things. Let us get you a doctor. We can fix this. We can be a family again." I reached into the pocket of my torn flannel shirt. My hand closed around the cold plastic of the digital voice recorder. I pulled it out. It was a small black device, insignificant looking, but it held the weight of a guillotine blade. I tossed it onto the coffee table. It landed with a heavy clatter right on top of the insurance papers. Derek looked at it. He knew what it was. He had seen me use it to dictate notes on construction sites for years. "Family," I said, my voice dripping with ice. "A family does not check to make sure the bodies are dead before they call 911. I reached out with a trembling finger and pressed the play button. The recording was crisp. The acoustics of the canyon had captured every syllable. First came the wind, then Derek's voice. "I cannot see them." "Are you sure, Mallory? That is a long way down. What if they are just hurt?" Then Mallory's voice filled the living room, loud and clear, shattering the last remnants of their defense. "Stop pacing, Derek. Nobody survives a drop like that. Do not be weak. Do you want to go to prison, or do you want $4 million? It is either them or us." I let the tape run. I let them hear the part about the wolves. I let them hear the part about the fake tears. When the recording ended, the silence that returned was heavy, suffocating, and final. I looked at Sheriff Miller. The man had stood up. His face was a mask of fury. His hand was resting on his holster. He wasn't looking at me with pity anymore. He was looking at Derek with the eyes of a lawman seeing a criminal. I looked back at my son. He had stopped shaking. He had stopped crying. He just stared at the recorder, realizing that the little black box had just closed the door on his life forever. "Accident," I whispered, leaning down so my face was inches from his. I stood up straight, adjusting my crutch. "Sheriff," I said, not taking my eyes off the man who used to be my son, "I believe you have heard enough to make an arrest." "And Frank," I added, looking at my friend, who was smiling grimly by the fireplace, "please hand me that pen. I have a new will to write." Sheriff Miller did not wait for an explanation. He had heard the voice of a woman plotting murder, and he had heard the voice of a son agreeing to it. He drew his service weapon, the heavy black steel looking absolute and final in the morning light. He stepped over the coffee table, kicking the insurance papers aside with his boot. "Derek, put your hands behind your head," Miller commanded, his voice shaking with a suppressed rage. "Now!" Derek did not move fast enough. He was still staring at the tape recorder, his mind trapped in the loop of his own voice condemning him. Miller grabbed him by the collar of the cheap suit jacket, spun him around, and slammed him chest first against the wall. The sound of the impact was satisfying, a dull thud that shook a painting crooked. I watched as the cold steel cuffs clicked around my son's wrists. Click, click. The sound of his freedom ending forever. Mallory tried to run. It was a pathetic attempt. She scrambled up from the floor, her eyes darting toward the French doors leading to the garden. But Frank was faster. My old friend moved with a speed that belied his age, stepping into her path like a concrete wall. "You are not going anywhere, Mrs. Thorne," Frank said, his voice calm and terrifying. "The only place you are going is a concrete box." Miller's deputy, who had been waiting in the car, burst through the front door and secured her. As they dragged Derek away from the wall, he looked at me. His face was a ruin of tears and snot. "Dad," he wailed. "Dad, please. She made me do it. I did not want to. I did it for us. I did it for the baby. I have a son coming, Dad. You cannot send your grandson's father to prison." I signaled the sheriff to wait. I leaned heavily on my crutch and limped toward Derek. I reached into the back pocket of my muddy jeans and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was damp with sweat and dirt, but the seal of the private laboratory was still visible. I looked at Mallory. She had stopped struggling. She was staring at the paper in my hand, and for the first time she looked truly destroyed. She knew what it was. "You did it for the baby," I repeated Derek's words. "You killed your mother and me to secure a future for your child. That is what you told yourself, isn't it?" I unfolded the paper. It was a DNA test result conducted on a sample I had taken from Mallory's hairbrush and a used coffee cup from Hartman's office 2 weeks ago, when I first started suspecting their affair. "You are right about one thing, Derek," I said, holding the paper up so he could read the bold text. "There is a baby, but you are not doing this for your son." I pointed a shaking finger at Robert Hartman, who was cowering in the armchair, trying to make himself invisible. "You killed us to support the child of the man who helped you plan our murder," I whispered. "The baby is Hartman's, Derek. They have been laughing at you for months. They were going to use you to get the money, and then they were going to bury you right next to us." Derek stared at the paper. He stared at the probability index. 99.9%. Robert Hartman. The sound that came out of Derek's throat was not human. It was the sound of a soul snapping in half. He did not look at me. He looked at Mallory. The love, the fear, the desperation in his eyes vanished, replaced by a hate so pure it burned the air between them. He lunged. Even with his hands cuffed behind his back, he threw himself at her, screaming, spitting, trying to tear her throat out with his teeth. The deputies had to tackle him, pinning him to the Persian rug, but he kept screaming. He screamed until his voice gave out sobbing into the wool, realizing he had sacrificed his parents, his soul, and his life for a lie. "Take them away," I said, turning my back on them. "I am done." As the deputies hauled the screaming trio out to the squad cars, Frank stepped forward. He picked up the fountain pen from the floor and wiped it clean with his handkerchief. "There is one legal matter left," Frank announced to the empty room. Under the Slayer rule, a statute present in almost every jurisdiction, an individual who feloniously and intentionally kills the decedent forfeits all benefits under the estate. Frank looked at me, then at the empty doorway where my son had just been dragged out. "Derek is legally disinherited," Frank said. "He gets nothing. Mallory gets nothing. The insurance policy, the house, the investments, they all revert to the estate." I looked at Patricia. She was standing by the window watching the police cars drive away. The flashing lights reflected in her eyes, but the fire was gone. She just looked tired. "We do not want it," Patricia said softly. "We do not want this house. It smells like betrayal. We do not want the money. It feels like blood." "We are not keeping it," I said. I took the pen from Frank. I pulled a fresh sheet of legal paper from his briefcase. I sat down at the coffee table. My hand was steady now. "I, Garrett Thorne." I wrote, speaking the words aloud. "Hereby place all assets, liquid and real estate, into an irrevocable trust for the sole benefit of my grandson, Leo Thorne. The trust will be administered by Frank Sterling until the boy turns 25. I signed my name. It was the most important signature of my life. "I want you to ensure Leo gets everything," Frank, I said. "Pay for his school. Pay for his therapy. Make sure he knows that his grandparents loved him even if his father was broken. And ensure that Derek never sees a dime of it, not for commissary, not for appeals, nothing." "Consider it done," Frank said, closing the briefcase. I stood up. I looked around the living room one last time. This was the house where I had raised a son. This was the house where I had almost died. It was just wood and stone now. The home was gone. "Let's go, Patricia," I said. "We have a boat to catch." 6 months later. The ocean air was clean. That was the first thing I noticed every morning when I woke up. It didn't smell like pine or damp earth or blood. It smelled like salt and freedom. I sat on the aft deck of the Horizon, a 40-foot catamaran we had bought with the retirement savings we had kept separate from the estate. My legs still ached when the weather turned a permanent souvenir from the cliff, but I could walk without the cane now. Patricia walked out from the cabin carrying 2 mimosas. Her hair had grown back, covering the scar on her forehead, and her skin was tanned from the Caribbean sun. She didn't look like the woman who had sharpened a knife in a panic room. She looked like herself again, only stronger. She handed me the glass and sat down next to me. We watched the sun dip below the horizon, turning the water into liquid gold. "Do you miss him?" she asked. She didn't have to say his name. I took a sip of the cold drink. I thought about the letters that arrived from the state penitentiary every week. Letters begging for forgiveness. Letters begging for money. I burned them unopened. "I miss the boy he was," I said honestly. "I miss the memory of him. But the man who sits in that cell, no. I do not miss him. He made his choice." Patricia nodded, leaning her head on my shoulder. We had cut out the cancer. It had been a painful, brutal surgery, but we had survived. We had lost a son, but we had found each other again. We had found a peace that could not be bought, only fought for. I looked at the wake trailing behind our boat, white foam disappearing into the deep blue. We were moving forward. The past was just water under the keel. Do not ever test the patience of a father who has spent a lifetime building bridges over chasms, I thought, closing my eyes and feeling the sun on my face. Because he knows exactly where the structural weaknesses are. He knows exactly which bolt to pull to bring the whole thing crashing down. And if you force him to destroy what he built, do not expect him to weep when you fall with the wreckage. This is Garrett Thorne signing off from the middle of the Atlantic. If you are listening to this, remember one thing. Blood makes you related. Loyalty makes you family. Do not ever confuse the two. If this story resonated with you, if you have ever had to make the hard choice to protect your own peace against the people you love, leave a comment below. Tell me your story. Survival is not just about staying alive. It is about knowing when to walk away and when to fight back. And to my grandson Leo, if you ever hear this one day, we are saving a seat for you on the boat. The world is wide, and you have nothing to fear from the wolves anymore. Your grandfather chased them all away. Lesson of the story. The most painful betrayal often comes from those we hold closest, but the story of Garrett and Patricia teaches us that dignity is non-negotiable. We often cling to toxic family relationships because of shared history or biology, believing that love means enduring abuse. However, true wisdom lies in recognizing that a family title is not a license to harm. Establishing boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of self-preservation. When trust is broken beyond repair, the bravest thing you can do is protect your legacy and give your resources to those who actually value your sacrifice. If you enjoyed this story of justice and resilience, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more real-life dramas. Have you ever had to cut a toxic family member out of your life to save yourself? Let me know in the comments section below. I read every single one. Until next time, stay strong and watch your back.